Thank you, choir. Thank you. That kind of sets the tone for what we want to think about today, about having God in us to that extent, remembering Him. We're looking at spiritual principles that will help defeat the plague. We don't maybe think of that. We don't necessarily think of spiritual solutions to impact a physical plague. But that's what God says to do. We look to heavenly things. We look to heavenly ways rather than simply what we can do ourselves. If we're dependent on only ourselves, we're in trouble, right? At least I feel like I am. I want to connect with God. But how do we do that? How do we connect with God to find help, to find healing? And so that's what we'll talk about today. We'll talk about fasting. Is probably not the highest subject for a sermon. Don't take a nap. But all the major, do you know that? Muslims practice fasting, all Christians, Catholics, the Mormons practice fasting, Jews do, Hindus, Buddhists, even pagan religions practice fasting. There just must be something about it. Even in 1756, the British king called for a fast in England because France was advancing on them and about to invade their nation. And then, on March 2nd, 1863, there was a resolution that was introduced in the U.S. Senate asking President Lincoln to call a fast, to proclaim a national day of prayer and fasting over factions in the nation, over the Civil War and the problems that the nation had. And so the resolution was adopted by the Senate and signed by Lincoln, and the fast was observed on March 31st. All churches were to fast and pray. Whereas the Senate of the United States, devoutly recognizing the supreme authority and just government of Almighty God in all the affairs of men and nations, has, by a resolution, requested the President to designate and set aside a day of public humiliation, prayer, and fasting to be observed by the people of the United States. Wow. Imagine that happening today. Historically, there has been this understanding of the need to call out to God by fasting. It kind of helps us know what do we depend on? Who do we depend on? And so we fast. It helps us know the answer. Some people fast for other reasons. I went for my annual visit. Some of you know I've had breast cancer, and I still go to an oncologist, and she gave me a scheduled fast and said, here, keep this for the next year. See if it helps. Not really. Wasn't quite like that, but she did give me a scheduled fast, and you grow into it. And she said it helps cancer, diminished cancer. It also helps diminish diabetes. Pretty amazing. Haven't tried it yet, hadn't started. I'll start about 3 weeks before I have to go back. So fasting helps the body and mind. It helps you begin to realize that you have control over what you eat and drink. You don't have to be subject to all of those desires. It teaches you to say no to cravings. It becomes a habit if you try it, and it has huge positive implications to your life. If you can learn to say no to eating, you can learn to say no to other bad habits that you may have that seek to control you. But fasting helps the soul as well. I mean, it helps the mind and the body. It clears your mind, helps your body, but it also helps the soul. By diminishing the physical, then we seek to integrate more and more with the spiritual. And we start seeing that the spiritual world is actually a real world, even though we can't see it necessarily. It's unseen, but it's all around us. And then we begin to depend on it and rely on the Lord, and we draw closer to God. And when we draw closer to God, we become stronger. Jesus is not just into self-denial. He wants to provide ways to help break down some of those hindrances we have, habits that enslave us. And his command to do these things in secret, thank you, Jeff, it breaks that need for human approval. Isn't that what God was saying with that passage from Isaiah, that you're doing all these things to look good, but you're not really taking care of people? You're missing something there. And so this passage that Jesus said goes like this. And when you fast, don't make it obvious as the hypocrites do, for they try to look miserable and disheveled so people will admire them for their fasting. I tell you the truth, that is the only reward they will ever get. But when you fast, comb your hair and wash your face, then no one will notice that you are fasting except your Father, who knows what you do in private. Everything will reward you. Now, it may be you may have no inclination to fast at all. You may say, okay, I'll be glad when it's next week and we don't have to listen to this anymore. I can't really think of a sermon on fasting that helped me. The first time I fasted, though, I remember. I lived in New York. Huntington Station, Long Island. I was 20 years old. And it was Good Friday. And I thought, I want to fast. I don't know why. Probably something that I heard. And so I worked as a clerk in a law firm. I didn't want to tell anybody that I was fasting that day. They were having a good time. They were talking about where they were going to go for lunch and then go home because they got the afternoon off. But I didn't want to be considered a fool, so I wasn't going to say I was fasting. But you see, I still remember it today. I didn't want to say anything because the culture that we live in, it kind of feeds our desires. It's not, fasting. Why would you do that? It doesn't value self-denial at all or self-restraint. It's a culture that's addicted to human approval. I knew I wouldn't be approved doing that. I would be questioned, maybe thought of as just plain silly. So I just kept it a secret for that reason, not just because I was trying to just please God. But Jesus offers us a life that's free from all that. You all know what that's like, don't you? Don't you know that? And so I was asking myself as I fasted, will it make a difference in my life? Will it help me? Will it help my focus? Well, it has kind of made a difference. I still doing that. And remember what I did at lunchtime instead of going out. Instead, I went to a little park in the center of town and sat and thought about what I was doing, thought about what Good Friday was about, thought about, the middle of the cross at noon, Jesus' agony. So Isaiah shares God's heart for the real meaning of fasting, what's on God's mind. God gives us tools to kind of break down those desires that we have, the desire for wanting approval, the desire for success, the desire for having a lot of stuff, or ambition or building things for ourselves. Not that those things are wrong, but Isaiah put it this way: we want to please ourselves. We want to push all that hard stuff aside. So today, I want to tell you a story. This story actually has nothing to do with fasting per se, but it's a story that kind of gets to the heart of what God is trying to help us understand and help us to learn. And this story is a story that shows us our nature and it shows us our reality, how we think. And so the story takes place in a small farming community with a small town, and the town has a mercantile, the town has a lumber yard, the town has a bank, a school, and a church, and the school and the church meet in the same building, the church. And they were all farmers. And they had good years and bad. They had successful, abundant crops. They had terrible crops of failure sometimes. They had good health. They had plagues. They were homesteaders. Most of all, they had everything wrapped up in that farm. They didn't have much of anything else, but that's what mattered, that farm. And when crops failed, they would help each other. They would share their food, share their resources, share seed for the next year. But if they failed really bad and had a lot of debt, then they'd have to move on. They had no choice. This was a community of self-sufficient people. They made everything that they needed, that they used, their food, their clothing, and when the need was too great, they worked together. Sometimes they plowed and planted together, usually, because mostly it was too big a job for one person. Sometimes they'd have to build a barn or build a house, and they would work together, and so that was a sense of community that they had. They helped each other. Little girls had a dress for school during the week and a dress for Sunday, and in the summer, they wore no shoes. It was 1888. That is the year my grandmother was born. She actually ended up raising 5 siblings when her mother died in childbirth. She herself bore 9 children, the last surviving one, my mother. It was a caring community, neighbor helping neighbor. One day, a man came to town, a lawyer, and he was seeking out one of the farmers, and he found that farmer, and he said, "Your uncle has died." "What uncle?" the man replied. "Well, the eccentric one, the one that lives in St. Louis." "Oh, well, I remember visiting him once when I was 10. "Well, he owned a fortune, and you are his only heir." Well, the man was shocked. What a surprise. Well, word traveled fast through the town, through all of the townspeople, and the whole town was talking, and the farmers' neighbors, they had for years planted together and plowed together for their spring crop. Well, that guy got jealous, and he thought, well, that man, I'm going to form a partnership with somebody else because he's got money to hire somebody now. The children's friends wouldn't play with them anymore. Others changed too. The fortunate man also worked at the lumber mill. He went to work one day, and the lumber guy, the boss said, "Hey, how about buying my mill?" He said, I don't want to buy your mill. I work here." The pastor asked him to buy the church an organ. The school board asked him to buy books for all the students. The mercantile owner said, "You can buy anything in this store you want," and sold some clothes, fine clothes, to this family. Probably they'd never had store-bought clothes before. And then the man bought his wife a brooch watch. And she bought him this big set of tools in a wooden box. And all of this was purchased on credit, because that's the way rich people do it. And the store owners were very happy. But then the lawyer told him it'd be a while. It takes a while to settle these things, so it'll be a while. And so time passed, and then pretty soon the creditors were coming after the store owners, and they were in a bad place because they had to pay the bill. So the wife, who was the more business person of the store, the husband and wife team, she called the man in and said, "You need to sign a lien on your farm." It was a hard day for the farmer. Finally, the lawyer shows up. The family gathers around him. He has a box, and he sets it down on the kitchen table, and he says, "I have some bad news. Your uncle was a really bad manager." And then there were bills. There was the banker, the broker, the lawyers, the court costs. Well, this is all that's left. And so the wife, she goes over to the box and she opens it up, and it's filled with cash. So she squeals with delight and she says, "We're rich, we're rich, we're rich. Now we will be okay." She pulls out a stack of bills, and the husband sees them, and it's all Confederate money. So now the reality of all that spending, now the reality sinks in. Everything's going to have to be auctioned. What will they do? And so on the morning of the auction, they stay in their house while the townspeople show up. And the auctioneer begins with each item. And with each item, someone bids. And so the first item, the disgruntled neighbor buys his farm for 2 cents. Then the lumberyard owner buys the tools for 2 cents. And next, the pastor buys a team of horses and his wagon for 2 cents. And the auction goes on and on. You see, the mercantile owner, the man, he went out on the road, on the outside of town, and he held up a sign. The auction for today is canceled. So no one came to the auction except the townspeople from the town. And that's why they were the only ones there. After the sale, the whole group that were there at the auction went to the farmer's house. The pastor said to him, "I bought your team for 2 cents. And the neighbor said, "Well, I bought your farm for 2 cents. And the lumberyard owner said, "I bought your tools for 2 cents. And then one of them said, "So for 6 cents, you can have back your farm and your horses and your tools." And then the school board head said, "We're going to buy the book, the children." And on it went. And then the store owner said, "The rest can just wait, because you'll get on your feet again and you'll work it off. And I trust that you will do that." And then the pastor spoke up and he said, "We're sorry. You weren't the one who changed. That was Grace." He said, We changed with the money that you were going to get. But now we feel that we're on the road back to recovery. We're on the road to being who we were. So why do we have spiritual disciplines like fasting? It's because the Lord wants us to keep our minds, keep our hearts on that straight road. And what's that straight road look like? It looks like caring about your neighbors. It looks like standing with them in the good and the bad. It looks like not making things matter too much, not taking advantage of people, but being with them, helping them when trouble comes. Jesus said, "Don't store up treasures here on earth, where moths eat them and rust destroys them, and where thieves break in and steal. Store your treasures in heaven, where moths and rust cannot destroy and thieves do not break in and steal. Wherever your treasure is," Jesus says, "there the desires of your heart will also be." Amen.